the term Underground Railroad tends to paint a picture of an orderly, mapped-out system of travel, but the reality for people fleeing slavery in the United States was a lot more complicated than that. And as a local historian has learned, many weren't even traveling on solid ground. The new book, Sailing to Freedom, tracks the path of thousands of enslaved people who escaped to the North by sea. Well, that book's editor, UMass Dartmouth history professor Timothy Walker, joins me now, as does Christian Walks, the director of education and interpretation programs at the Museum of African American History. Thank you so much for you both being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
So, Professor Walker, I would love to talk about what made you want to put this book together. Why do you think it's so important?
Well, I grew up in the Midwest in Ohio, where the Underground Railroad was almost exclusively a terrestrial story. But I moved out to Massachusetts to go to graduate school and then to work at UMass Dartmouth. And I also started working on some of the tall ships that sail up and down the East Coast as training vessels. So I became very interested in this maritime component. We ran a program about the Underground Railroad in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where I live. And it turns out that New Bedford was a very important terminus point where people escaping enslavement came to work and to live, where they could live in freedom. And we found out that an extraordinary number of them were arriving by water. And so we ran a National Endowment for the Humanities program about this, brought in experts from all over the East Coast. And it just became clear that this was a story about the Underground Railroad that was very little known, had not been studied very much. And we wanted to look into this. And the book grew out of that effort.
And Christian, why do you think this is part of the story of American slavery that hasn't been told?
And, there are many parts of the story that haven't been told. For many years, much of this work had to happen covertly. And so when you're thinking about people escaping and seeking refuge, many of these networks, whether they were on ground or all over the sea, they had to be kept in some sort of secrecy. And so I think part of the issue is going back in history and trying to read in between the lines many times to recuperate these stories that are oftentimes lost out of folks' need for security and secrecy in order to move throughout these networks to freedom.
And, Professor Walker, talk to me about the process in gathering up these stories, because we know that these accounts can be very difficult to track down and get.
Well, some of the best clues we have come from published narratives that were published after the Civil War, once slavery had been outlawed. And something like 70% of narratives published by persons who had escaped bondage into freedom, about 70% of them reference escaping by ship, by water along the eastern seaboard. And so that was a big important clue. And then another one is so-called runaway slave ads that owners of enslaved people would place in newspapers. They usually described the method by which they suspected their property had escaped. And so looking at those, it was clear that again and again and again, we find owners who are saying that my enslaved person escaped by water, by ship. And so with evidence like that, we started looking deeper and finding more and more stories about how people arrived to the North by water.
I think it was fascinating, too, in looking at your book and researching this topic, is that after, crossing the Atlantic during the slave trade there, the folks would be willing to get back on a ship to their freedom.
Well, a lot of the people that we're talking about by the 1830s and 40s and 50s, the importation of enslaved people was illegal after 1808 in the United States. And so a lot of the people that we're talking about, they were working in waterfront capacities. They were working in maritime trades. They were intimately familiar with the water and with ships. And for them, it was a very natural thing to get aboard vessels that they normally were working on in port cities in the South. They would have opportunities that other people working inland in agricultural enslavement, people working inland would not have the opportunities to escape by water that port workers would. And so it was quite familiar to them to go. And in New Bedford, when they arrive in New Bedford, they are often working in the same kinds of trades and earning money as free laborers that they hadn't done when they were in the South as enslaved people.
Interesting. Christian, you know, when we would cover new layers of African American history, new stories like this, I imagine it's gratifying to be able to put it on display, show it, amplify work like Professor Walker's.
Absolutely. It is so important because oftentimes folks are leaving records, as with Professor Walker mentioned, through narratives, for example. And oftentimes you have to go and read between the lines of certain ads where they're trying to track down folks. But having a full story from the perspective of these people who are traveling and seeking refuge is important. And that's something that we strive to do at the museum, is bring attention to these stories by putting forth that Black voice in those seeking refuge and centering that for the public to understand the story.
And Christian, do you think that folks don't realize that rich history of working with ships, working in the maritime spaces at this time in history?
I think that is an undertold part of the journey from slavery to freedom. Many people aren't familiar with folks like Absalom Boston, who has deep connections to our site in Nantucket. He was the first Black captain of an all-Black crew and amassed a bunch of wealth through the whaling industry. And so this sort of maritime industry is understudied, I think, and not well understood in our public understanding.
Professor Walker, did anything surprise you as you were pulling together the research for this book?
I think the sheer numbers surprised me. We came to think of the maritime side of the Underground Railroad as being rightly thought of as really the other half of the story. Anyone escaping from the far South did it by water. Almost all overland escapes were relatively short escapes from states that were slave states bordering on a free state. But if you wanted to escape a very long distance, you almost had to do it by water. And once you're out to sea, 3 miles offshore, where there is no enforcement, you're in international waters, your pathway to escape is relatively safe. That wasn't true on land. On land, you had all kinds of impediments to your freedom, including slave patrols and things like that. So it was a much easier thing to do once you were aboard a ship to get to freedom. And ships traveled faster. On land, you would go maybe 20 miles a day. A ship could go 150, 180 miles in a day.
That's fascinating. We know of legends like Harriet Tubman on the Underground Railroad. Do you think that sort of allowed us to think of the actual, space or the Underground Railroad itself as being terrestrial only because there were these legends that were there? And if so, were there any similar that you uncovered in your research on the water?
Well, I think that most historians in the United States are not trained in maritime skills, so they don't use maritime archives. And we focus on the stories that we're familiar with. And so folks were very well aware of people escaping over land in Ohio and Indiana and in Pennsylvania. But they just weren't as familiar with those maritime stories until we started looking at them here in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and began to realize just how important they were. But there are numerous people whose stories sort of mirror the extraordinary courage of Harriet Tubman. And this is in no way to diminish the terrestrial story. It's very important. But we just want people to understand that the maritime side is at least as important and accounts for an enormous number of people escaping from enslavement in the U.S. South.
Absolutely, and certainly an extremely interesting read. We want to thank you both for your time, Professor Timothy Walker and Christian Walks. Thank you so much.
Thank you.